I want to tell you about our speaker. I'm going to tell the formal stuff, and then Mike Buckley is going to come tell you a little something else. But Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell is a Johns Hopkins trained neuropsychiatrist and neuroscientist, formerly Harvard faculty. She's an award-winning author and clinician. She has worked internationally and has a private practice in Oregon. As an expert on PTSD, she co-created psychiatry programs for the survivors of torture, international, and for the McCandless Women's Center in San Diego. She has served as a member of the think tank on human consciousness at the Salk Institute and is the director of research for the John E. Mack Institute, was. Is that correct? Was. Her current research focuses on investigating reports of telepathy, precognition, and other anomalies by parents of autistic children, which she will talk about tonight. Her lay publications include the book The ESP Enigma, A Scientific Case for a Psychic Phenomenon, and the 2007 Shift Report, Evidence of a World Transforming. Before we welcome her, let me have Mike come in and just say a few words.
So I planned to have Diane here at least 2 years before, but she had an interesting journey in that 4 years that it took to get her here. But first, I'll also say that she has a book that's also its 10th anniversary, The ESP Enigma. And unlike Russell Targ, who said ESP exists, or the proof for ESP, she just called it an enigma. She never said, I believe in it, or I'm just going to give you the history and all the anomalies and let you figure it out. But in the interim, and she can tell you the dates, I can't, but a colleague who was jealous of her or something realized she had written the book and then turned her into the Oregon Medical Society with the complaint that, hey, she believes in ESP, so how can she take care of crazy people? Because she'll be telling them that, God is channeling through them, they're not really crazy, and it'll make them more crazy. So the board, never reading the book, never analyzing it, never looking at the footnotes, never looking at the primary sources, took her license away, her medical license, because she had the nerve to believe in the ESP that might exist. And so she had to actually have Daniel Sheehan and some other lawyers reinstate her. But the internet, it never goes away. So when you Google her name, you'll see disbarred doctor or something like that, or quackery. But she got her license back. She's fully licensed. She just got through with 6 hours of interviews in New York with Deepak Chopra for a video thing that's going to be made shortly. You can ask her later about why she went to Nepal, why they asked her to go to Nepal, and why she's been asked by an Indian tribe to bring her down to Southern California for an initiation. I'm not going to say anything more. You can ask that if you want to. And so she is about ready to break like Bruce Lipton or somebody in their early years, where you're going to turn on the TV and you probably get tired of seeing her. But she's here for us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. And actually, Daniel Sheehan told me that there was nothing I could do about the medical board. They're totally immune from prosecution. And so what I did was I had to go through 3 days, 8-hour days of complete psychological testing, including IQ testing, MMPI, Rorschach, everything to prove that I wasn't crazy. And because I'm not, I have no history of any psychiatric problems, I was able to get my license back in 3 months. They didn't want to give it back to me. But anyway, what happened is that for me, someone who had never, ever had, I was a straight A student. I mean, I was one of these people who always had accolades. And so for me to have my license taken away on an emergency basis was such a trauma for me. And what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to look for evidence that is just irrefutable. I made that my first goal. My second goal was once I discovered that there really is a lot of good evidence out there. I mean, Russell Targ's in the audience. I mean, he's done amazing work. You know, there's lots of people I can cite who have really, as far as I'm concerned, they've really raised the question of whether or not these phenomena are real. And so what I realized was we don't have a problem with our model in modern physics. I mean, you know, 100 years ago, we discovered that the world is really not as we think it is, that we discovered that time is an illusion, that, and, you know, we had, you know, the quantum physics, you know, the birth of quantum physics, where we realized that there's this interaction between consciousness and the material world. And I don't want to bore you with that because I'm sure you're all very familiar with it, but I realize it's not our model in physics that's a problem. And so it's really how we think about the brain that's the issue here, that it's really hard for us to think about how this organ could even do the types of phenomena that people report as occurring. And my background before going into psychiatry was as a neuroscientist. I worked in neuroscience laboratories. I did voltage clamping with axons from crayfish. I did, and making, you know, microelectrodes and doing recordings of that. I did electron microscopy. I did neurochemistry. I did a lot of different things, both theoretically and in the laboratory, that gave me this background in neuroscience that I have drawn upon in working towards building a theory for a new understanding about how the brain works. And I realized many, many years ago that if we were to solve this problem, that a phenomenon called autistic savants might really hold the answers. And the reason for that, it'll become clear as I get into my lecture, is that their skills are so similar to what we call ESP that I really think that they would be labeled ESP if it wasn't for the fact that that term has such a stigma to it. And it's one of those mysteries. And so I started searching for savants. And the story is that I went to India back in 2011. So my book came out in the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, lost my license in 2010. And I went to India in 2011 because there were some savants over there. And when I went over there to evaluate them, initially my thinking was, okay, there are these children who've been reported to be able to draw the periodic table even though they've never studied it. How do they do that? How is that possible? And who know all kinds of information. How is this possible? And what I discovered when I was there was that a lot of the parents of these children told me, took me aside and said, well, they're also telepathic. And then I thought, oh, well, that's a problem because I've been exposed to science. And so I know the answers to the things. How do I know that they're not getting this material from somebody's mind? So I started doing research on telepathy with these children. And I'll be able to show you a little bit of video today as well. This child, Ramses, I mean, how many of you know about my work? Am I totally new to all of you, or how many of you? So people raising their hands know of my work? Oh, okay, this is, most of you don't. Okay, so Ramses is this little boy. I met him when he was 5 years old. And how I met him was that I had, somebody contacted me on Facebook and said, I know you're doing research on telepathy in autistic children. There's this child, there's videos of him doing telepathy on Facebook. And so I looked at the videos and I'm like, oh my gosh. And so I contacted the mother and met with her. And I met him when he was 5 years old. And the mother reported that at the age of 2, he already could read and speak 8 languages. And these languages weren't just ordinary languages. They included Russian, Japanese, Hebrew, Arabic, Greek, Spanish, English. So he was in Hindi. So he had these language skills, and the mother says, I don't know where he got this. I mean, we could figure out that he learned the English and Spanish possibly from her because she was bilingual. And he moved to Japan. They moved to Japan when he was 6 months old. But where did the Hebrew and the Hindi and the Arabic and the Russian, where did all of that come from? So this picture is of me, and I'm holding a piece of paper where I went to test him to see, can he really read these languages? Can he really draw these characters, that are part of their alphabet? And sure enough, he has an amazing knowledge of multiple languages. And on top of that, at the age of 5, he could read college-level science books. And I actually have continued to work with him and helped him to attend a full year of freshman physics at the University of San Diego at the age of 8. He's now 9. And this media group from Britain came and they videoed a telepathy experiment that I did with him. And I've tested him many times. And they videoed an experiment, which we were just doing right there in front of them. And it went viral. I mean, it's been seen by millions of people all around the world. And we did a follow-up just about a month and a half ago. I went to see him again, and a French media group wanted to do a documentary about him. And so we did another telepathy experiment there. And it was interesting because I saw this difference in him. He's now 9. And as he's getting older, he's starting to realize that most people think that this kind of thing is weird. And so what happens is a lot of children start to go underground with their skills. And when we were there with the French media group, they were there to do really a documentary about all of his skills, not just the telepathy thing. And they had said that we wouldn't have to do telepathy. And then at the last minute, they said, let's just see if we can do telepathy. And at first, the little boy just started to melt down. He goes, no, it's too hard. It's too hard. I'm just like, okay, well. And then he agreed to it. And we did the experiment with him wearing one of those. There are these masks that you can buy that have all of this padding around the eyes so that you really can't see anything. And we did an experiment with him wearing that, and he was 100% accurate. So it really shocked the people that were there witnessing it. So this is a set of autistic twins, John and Michael, and they were studied by Oliver Sacks in the 1960s. And Oliver Sacks is the most famous person. Oliver Sacks is just one of the people who have studied savants. Daryl Trefford is actually another person who has studied them. And in fact, one of the first children that I did extensive studies on, I did 3 days of controlled studies with random numbers and random, and also using random words and this little girl who was had a form of autism where she was nonverbal. In other words, she couldn't speak. And so what she would do is, instead of speaking, she had learned how to communicate by first pointing to a stencil board and pointing at the letters she wanted. And then she progressed from that to being able to type independently. But when I instituted a barrier between her and the therapist that she was doing the telepathy experiments with, she regressed and she stopped typing independently. And so we had to go back to her pointing on the letterboard. And I recorded my experiments. I had cameras on, I had 5 cameras in the room just documenting everything. And she was 95%, 97% accurate. I mean, including out of, it was 166 digits, random digits. She only made 7 errors, and she corrected each one of those on the second try. And her story was that she was working with this therapist, learning, who would come into the home and do homework with her. And she really didn't do very well at simple math, but then when they got into these mathematical equations, she always knew the answer to these mathematical equations. And this person who was working with her just kept giving her more and more difficult equations to solve, and was just shocked that she would know the answers. And then what happened one day was that the device that she was using to calculate the answers to these equations, the power went out or something, and so she had to go to another device. And that device gave her the answer in logarithmic notation. And she saw the child give the answer in logarithmic notation. She's like, how is it you're doing this? She said, it's like you're reading my mind. And the child said, I do. And then the therapist said to her, well, if you're reading my mind, then what's my landlord's name? And the landlord's name was Helmet. And she said, Helmet. And so she asked her, several other questions that this little girl knew the answer to. And she was so blown away, and she didn't know what to do with this information. She eventually told the parents, who initially were very scared of it. And then when they saw her do it, they realized this is really important for a scientist to know about, which is one of the reasons why they contacted both Daryl Trefford and contacted me to come and be aware of it. And actually, her father is a psychiatrist, so he's really aware of how this really just, blows the bottom out of our model for how things work. And so what happened is that this second therapist was working with her because the first therapist was a part-time mother and didn't have that much time. And then she noticed that this child would make the same errors that she made. And she's like, wait a minute. She says, this is like you can read my mind. And she said, how? And then she said, tell me. She said, tell me, Haley. She says, how do you say I love you in German? This little girl didn't know German, and yet she typed out Ich liebe dich, which is German for I love you. And so now we had a second therapist who was like blown away by this. And so when I went to study her, I was actually able to test her with 2 different therapists. And it's so profound, and I really wanted to understand, well, how could this possibly work? And I presented the results at the PA conference several years ago, and have since then had many parents and also sometimes it's teachers contact me about their child and saying that they know that I'm onto something, that there's really something here. And so I want to show you a DVD at this point, just a little short glimpse, just for you to get a sense of it. And so this is a boy whose name is Akil, and today's his 18th birthday, and he's going to the prom. And I did this a couple of years ago. So this is not the most recent data with him, but this is what I have on a DVD. So this shows you my first experiment with him. And so we had multiple cameras around, but the mother is still, she's in the room with him, and but I just was recording everything to see what was there. I have since gone back and did experiments with him in which I had the mother behind him such that he couldn't see her, because there's been some concern about, well, how do we know the mother's not giving some kind of codes, with her, with their hands or whatever. So I've since done that, and I actually had Deepak Chopra come and witness an experiment, and he was so blown away that when he left his jacket and his wallet and his, his backpack. So we had to send them by a car to him in New York. So if we could just watch a little bit of this, it'll give you kind of a sense. Now, so these children, one of the things to understand is that these nonverbal children, they have difficulty controlling their body. And there was a book that was written by a Japanese boy with autism. The name of it is The Reason I Jump, and it was translated into English. And he said something very interesting. He said, the reason I jump is so that my soul won't leave my body. And so there's this tenuous relationship that they seem to have between their mind and their body, and it makes it very hard for them to do things that require a lot of coordination. And so you'll see when he's typing that a lot of what he does is he'll have to go back to self-correct because he's hitting like this, and he'll oftentimes hit the wrong key, but then he'll go back. So if we could have the video. So you can see those are the stimuli. So these were just words that I just randomly picked and then used random.org to put them into a random order. And then I presented the list to the mother, and she would look at them, and then he would start typing. So you could see him over there typing. So he's trying to get that T for movie ticket. When I first went to test him, when I first walked into the room, he was extremely agitated. There's something that happens with these children when they get asked to do this, that they just get so much energy that they get really agitated sometimes. And so when I first came, he was throwing furniture and other objects across the room, and the mother was just calmly, moving them aside. And for about 45 minutes that this was going on, and then he just suddenly, quietly went and sat down at his computer and typed, "Why are you here?" And I explained that I was there to test him for telepathy. And he said, "Why do you want to test me for telepathy?" And I said, "Well, because this is a really important phenomenon. I've heard that you're really good at it. And if it's real, then it has major consequences for people in the world." And then he typed, "I'm ready for your research." And then this is what he started doing. Can you see it okay? So you can let me know how much of this you want to see. But the point is that I did, on this first go around, I did 2 different sets of 10 words or word combinations. And he got all of them right. He just makes little typos, but he's trying to type calendar.
So the mother was reading the words on the other side of the room, and then he would pick it up from the mother and type the words? Okay.
Correct. So this will be rabbit hole.
Who's the lady on the right? The one in the white.
That's the mother. And so what's happening here is, this is one of the reasons why I had to come back and do more experiments. She gets so, and she has to do something with her energy too, because it's really hard for her to contain it. So she does this funny thing with her hands. And that was one of the confounding variables. It's one of the reasons why I had to come back and do the experiments and have her out of his sight. And she wants to help to prove telepathy. So we're working towards having the optimal conditions. I know this isn't the optimal experimental conditions.
Silently thinking the word, or did she verbalize it?
Oh, no, she's silently thinking it. Yeah, no, there's no, I mean, the audio, I thought the audio was on with this. But no, she's just silently thinking the word. So this is going to be juice bottle. You can see how much trouble he has with typing.
Is she holding note cards, or is there a screen that you're referencing?
No, she would. What she would do is she would go and look around. You know, she'd go like this to look at the computer screen to see what the stimulus were. But I've done experiments with them in multiple different ways. I always mix it up. So another thing that we did once, where we stood on the opposite side of a room from him, and I just would point to a word in just a random book or something, and I'd point to it, and she would just be thinking that, and then he would type it out. So so it's
If you thought of a word, would he pick up your thoughts?
I really that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that one of the confounding variables is other people having information, and one of the things that I want to do is see whether or not he can be telepathic with me as well. But first, I think you need to develop a bond. I mean, so much of the research on telepathy is that you really have more of a chance if there's some kind of an emotional bond, and that's what I've seen over and over again. And there's also this, that the people who are working with these children to try to teach them language, because of the fact that they're focusing on the same thing together, I think that's like a great training ground for people to learn telepathy, learn how to do it. So I think that might be enough video, and we can move on to some other things. Thank you. Okay. So when you ask some of these savants, how do you know the answers? A common thing that they will say is that they see the answers. So, for example, those twins, you back up, these twins were able to, that were studied by Oliver Sacks, they were able to give prime numbers. And they had this game in which one would give a 6-digit prime number, and then the other one would say what the next consecutive prime number was, and they would just do it back and forth as a game. And Oliver Sacks was fascinated by this, and he went and got a prime number table, and he came back with an 8-digit prime and said it to them, and they looked at him and they were like, oh, he knows prime numbers. And then they started doing 8-digit prime numbers back and forth. He got them to do 20-digit prime numbers, but at the time, they were only able to validate the up to 12-digit prime numbers because the computers at the time in the 60s didn't have the capacity that these kids did. And they also didn't know how to do simple math. They were also calendar calculators. A lot of these savants they're calendar calculators, and what that means is that they can tell you, if you give them, they could do it for 80,000 years, spanning, forwards and back, and they could tell you, what day of the week a certain date would fall on for any particular year. They could even tell you when Easter would fall, And so how did they do this? And what they said was that the information just appeared to them. They just saw it. That they weren't deriving it at all. Which is why I have this slide here. And similarly, the little girl who was able to solve these mathematical problems. And it turns out she wasn't really a mathematical savant. She was just reading the therapist's mind. When asked, how do you do it? She said, well, I see the numerators and denominators in your head. And some of them report that they see the information in someone's aura field. So it's fascinating to me that that's the way in which the information comes to them. Daniel Tammet is another autistic savant, and his claim to fame is that he can recite pi, which is this it's a constant, but if you look at pi, it just, there's a non-repeating number, and it goes on and on and on, and he can recite it to 22,000 digits in 5 hours. And how he describes being able to do that is that each number has a different color and shape. And so he sees what looks like a ticker tape parade of just all of these shapes of different colors going in front of him. He just calls them off. So it's all effortless. Leslie Lemke is a savant who shows us something else. Not all savants are autistic. So you can have a savant who has these skills because they're blind. And so Leslie was born prematurely, and his eyes were damaged because he was so young. He developed glaucoma, and they had to remove both of his eyes when he was only a few months old. And he also had cerebral palsy. And so he was abandoned, and the woman who adopted him, she painstakingly worked with him to even get him to do basic things like eat and to even walk. She strapped him to her body and would help him to walk like that. He didn't learn how to walk till he was 12 years old. Then when he was 14 years old, he spontaneously he spontaneously went to a piano and was able to play Tchaikovsky's Concerto No. 1 flawlessly. And he became a concert pianist. So it raises the question, what is it about blindness that can bring on savant syndrome? There's something called acquired savant syndrome, which can be brought on by head injury, and also people who have a type of dementia in which it's called frontotemporal dementia. So this slide shows you what part of the brain is affected in Alzheimer's disease, which is the dementia that most people think about, what you see here is in, oops, sorry. Okay, all right, getting used to it. Okay, so what you see here is that in the frontotemporal dementia, the part of the brain that dies back is predominantly the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes, and so which is a very different pattern from Alzheimer's. And when people have this type of a dementia, this is work done by Bruce Miller at UCSF. What happened is that a lot of these people suddenly acquired artistic and musical skills. And the question is, why is it that when you lose brain tissue that you can actually acquire these phenomenal skills? And what I suggest is that one of the things that I've been interested in is the brain pattern that's associated with psychic phenomena. And many people who otherwise don't have psychic abilities can have a psychic dream. And during the time when we're dreaming, the brain activity is such that the frontal lobes are shut down. And the frontal lobes are the part of the brain that really makes judgments about things, and has expectations about things and plans ahead and et cetera. So when you shut down the frontal lobes, you no longer have this inhibition of other sections of the brain. And similarly, when you're dreaming, your right hemisphere is more active than your left, which is the reverse of what it's like when we're awake. And so I suggested that basically what you have is these conditions in which you have the brain's activity when somebody's awake that's more similar to the brain activity of somebody when they're in dreaming sleep. And in autism, they have left hemisphere deficits. They frequently have problems with that, and a lot of the savant skills are right hemisphere skills. So when they're walking around, their brain is really more similar in certain ways to the brain's activity at sleep. So this is, many of you have heard of blindsight, I'm sure, which is another phenomena that is fascinating, that people who are blind are able to, they don't think that they see anything, but they're able to accurately say what something is that is put in front of them, whether it's a circle or a square, that sort of thing, and yet they're blind. And this is a woman who had blind sight, but she had this interesting twist to it, because there's something called redox syndrome, and what that is where there's been, this woman had a stroke, and it affected her visual cortex such that she could only see something if it was moving. So as soon as it stopped moving, everything went black. She didn't see anything anymore. And so you have, in the visual cortex, you have all of these different, the visual stimuli are divided up into all of the different components. Something that's moving this way will have certain cells fire and result. They'll have some cells that only respond to an angle. You'll have other cells that only respond when something's moving, et cetera, et cetera. And so some blind spot can be explained by the fact that you actually have some vision, but it's like this intermittent, because it's only picking up certain aspects. Hydrocephalus is a condition that has these following symptoms that can go along with it: social learning disorders, extensive rote memories, so they have great memories, poor coordination, precocious puberty, and enlarged heads. And what's happening today is that I discovered when I was out there in the field and doing this research is that a lot of these children who are being diagnosed as autistic actually have hydrocephalus. And the criteria for autism is that you have poor social learning, and you have poor social learning, and you have a language issue. And so if you think about it, these people with hydrocephalus really have a lot of overlap with autism, and I think it's just lack of really good diagnosis, really. And it turns out a lot of people think that Rain Man was autistic because of the movie, and he gets called an autistic savant, but he wasn't autistic. He actually had hydrocephalus. And so Kim Peek was a remarkable man. He had this phenomenal memory. He had, by the time he died in his late 50s, he had over 12,000 books memorized, word for word, and he could recite them backwards and forwards. And that's just a fraction of the information that he knew. And then on top of that, one of the things that's really interesting is that he could, you see how he's, how closely he's looking at that book. He actually could read 2 books simultaneously, one with each eye. And it's like, how is that kind of parallel processing possible? And if you look at his brain, this is a normal brain, and this is his brain, and with the hydrocephalus. And hydrocephalus is actually caused by a problem with the cilia that line the ventricles and are supposed to help with circulating the cerebrospinal fluid. And something goes wrong with with that movement of the cilia, and so you get this backup of pressure. And what it does is it pushes, when you have an infant who develops this condition, it pushes the brain against the skull. And it creates this larger head. Kim Peek's head was so large, he couldn't hold it upright for the first several years of his life. This is research that was done on people with hydrocephalus by a British neurologist named John Lorber, and he published one of these cases in Science. And what's remarkable is he studied over 600 people with hydrocephalus, and what he found was those that had the severe hydrocephalus. I mean, look at this. This is all of this. It's hard to get used to this. I keep wanting to get that little dot there, and I'm advancing the slide. Sorry. So look at this big hole here. That's Kim Peek's brain, and then look at this. That's an absence of brain tissue there. This is what a normal brain looks like. And what Dr. Lorber found was that half of the people who had a brain scan that looked like that had normal or better IQs. How is that possible? So these savants and these hydrocephalics are part of the literature in neuroscience and neuropsychiatry, and yet, why is it that they're? To me, the exception is really, what you should be looking at, because it's really challenging our idea about how the brain works. There are also people who can be born without a cerebellum. And the cerebellum is in the back of the head. You can see this big hole here. And it actually has as many neurons as the rest of the brain. And yet people can be born without a cerebellum, and they appear totally normal. This is an incidental finding. So the whole issue of memory, it gets blown out of the water because, when, I was training as a neuroscientist, we think of memory as something where you have one neuron connecting with another neuron, and the synaptic connection between the two of them is somehow reinforced by, having a repeated experience. And then it's the reactivation of that neuronal circuitry that's supposed to bring back the memory. But if you have so little neuronal tissue, how can you have an extensive memory? It just defies sense. And so I also look across species for answers. I really am multidisciplinary in my approach. And there was research that came out of Georgetown by Dr. Weiss, Martha Weiss, and she was looking at the moth, and what she found was that you can train a moth to associate a stimulus with an adversive stimulus. Do that paired association, like Pavlovian conditioning. And what happens is you train the caterpillar with this, And then the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis stage, and during that time, these enzymes are secreted, and the brain is basically it's liquefied with just a few neurons at most left. And so she then tested the moths to see if they retained the memory, and they did. So there's also a creature called a sea squirt, and they're one of the tunicates, and there's one species that grows a brain, and it really kind of looks like a little miniature brain like our brains. It actually grows a brain only when it needs to navigate. And then as soon as it settles down into its new place, then it reabsorbs the brain. And so do I take questions now, or do I, do you have a question now? Yes. This is what I'm going to get into in a little bit. This is another blind savant, and to show you how important navigation is, and it may be one of the main reasons why we have brains is to assist us in navigation. He was born blind, but he can climb mountains. He can do all kinds of things through echolocation. What he does is he makes these little clicking noises with his mouth, and then his brain is now using the visual cortex to map out his surroundings. And they've actually done imaging studies to show that the visual cortex is actually being used in echolocation. And at first, excuse me, yes?
When you say they can see, how accurate? So they can see a mountain range, or they can see a lake. Could he or she see a Porsche Carrera and say, I see a black Porsche Carrera, or I see a white Porsche Carrera? Or do they see images of something the size of a Porsche Carrera?
It's really, I'm very interested in what is their internal world like. Is it that they're actually, seeing images? Because I know that to people who become blind later on will still see when they dream. So they actually like dreaming because that's when they get to see things. But I really don't know what his inner experience is like. I've never met him, but he can navigate. He can do his life fairly normally, so he'd be able to, recognize, he'd be able to recognize objects, so he'd be able to recognize that car. But I don't know whether or not he actually has like any kind of imaging in his mind at all.
The reason I ask that is because there's studies that are done in the near-death field, the out-of-body field rather, where people have come out and they're able to, a blind person is able to actually describe contents in the room in great detail. And we could make an assumption that it's not the brain that's actually receiving that information, it's the consciousness itself. So when that spirit comes out, whatever you want to call it, that's what's actually seen, not through physical eyes.
Right, and I've heard that. I've heard
so
that.
I wonder
yes.
about some of these people. They could be older souls who have taken on a very difficult life to wake a lot of us up who are pretty self-absorbed. There's more and more people with autism, more and more savants available, and they're really, it's very interesting at this time in history that we're having so many of them show up on the planet. And so for navigation, getting back to that, so we actually have a GPS in our brain. And there's a section of the brain called the hippocampus, and we have cells there that'll fire when we're in a certain region. And so there's
we have place cells and we have grid cells. And so it's fascinating to me that we actually have that built in, and that we're able to capitalize on that. Robin Baker was a psychologist, British psychologist, who did research on people that he blindfolded, and he discovered that they could, the high percentage of them could find their way home. And he wondered, how is this possible? And he did over a decade of research on this and was convinced that we have a magnetic sense of direction. And what happened is that the ability went away when he put a magnet on their head. And I wondered, why could that be? So research out of Caltech by somebody named Kershink and has shown that he's been doing research on magnetite. And we have magnetite. When magnetite is in biological organisms, it's different from magnetite that you find forming outside of tissue. And you find it in simple organisms, including, this is a bacteria. And so the magnesomes basically enable worms and all kinds of animals to have a sense of direction. And we have magnetite. This thing doesn't, yeah. We have magnetite, but where we have it is we have it in our nose, which is interesting because it's like the bird's beak, where they have magnetite. We also have magnetite in the ethmoid bone, which is also, centrally located. You could see the little skull up there, and it shows you where this bone is. And we have it in the sphenoid. And the sphenoid bone is an interesting one because it's the only cranial bone that it touches all of the other cranial bones. And if you look at it, it looks kind of almost like, if you know what the pelvis looks like, it almost looks kind of like the pelvis, looks kind of like a butterfly. And if you look at the whole system, there's magnetite not just in the bones, but there's magnetite in the brain. There's 20 times as much magnetite in the membranes that surround the brain. So there's the pia mater, which is the membrane that's closest to the brain tissue. And then there's this electrolyte fluid in between. It's like a sandwich. And then above that is the dura mater, which is which also has a high amount of magnetite in it. And the dura mater, they go all the way down the spinal column. So you have the whole cranium and the whole spinal column is full of all this magnetite. And what I thought was really interesting is that if you look at the shape of it, the combination of that sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bones with the magnetite, and then it going all the way down the spinal column, it kind of reminds me of the symbol for psi. If you look at the ventricles, which are these cavities in the brain, they are, and the ones that get enlarged in dementia and that are enlarged in hydrocephalus, they have a very similar shape to the magnetite. And they're full of electrolyte-containing fluid. And in addition, they have all of these cilia that are circulating the fluid, and they also have melanin. And I know a lot of you know about melanin, probably from Frank Barr, and melanin has a lot of special properties. It's a semiconductor. It also responds to light stimuli, sound stimuli, electrical stimuli, and melanin is what determines the beat frequency of the cilia. So, so it could be playing a role in this hydrocephalus. And I just thought that it's interesting. The caduceus looks almost like those ventricles, and I mean, it's a similar shape. So, actually, I'm not going to get into that right now. But this is looking at what we have here is we have these. We have throughout nature, we have these patterns that are, like the Fibonacci sequence. We can see these patterns, this double spiral. And so, examples like the pine cone or the nautilus shell, we've heard about these. And what I find interesting is that, they relate to fractals. And this is Jason Paget, who is an acquired savant. He was leaving a karaoke bar and he got attacked and ended up, having severe head trauma. And after that, he just spontaneously sees fractals everywhere. And he also gained these abilities in mathematics that he didn't have before. And you see the golden ratio represented in the whole, in the body, all of the relationship of the digits to one another and all the bones to one another. So the symbol phi, which is the symbol for the golden ratio, to me looks a lot like electromagnetic flux lines. Here's the Earth's magnetic field with the electromagnetic flux lines. And this brings us to what's going on with, this is the torus, which I know all of you have heard about the torus. If you're talking about the movie Thrive, you've heard about that. And when I look at some of these objects, and some of these objects in nature, like the apple, I mean, it's easy to see a similarity between the shape of the apple and the torus. I think that there's a relationship there, that we have a field that is directing the development and the shape. And this is a cross section. There's the fields in the body. Boy, I'm really having trouble with this. Is that it? Is that the problem? So I have to be pointing it over here, but then I'm looking over here. Let's see if no, I don't want to block that. Yeah, it's just kind of challenging. It really is. Okay, well, just move along. So how many of you ever heard of Shafika Karagula? Okay, so a few people here. She was the aunt of George Norrie, and she was a neuropsychiatrist in LA. And she became interested in studying, she called it higher sense perception, which is essentially ESP. And she studied a lot of prominent people. And she worked with Wilder Penfield. And her assistant was this woman named Diane. And that was the name that pseudonym she gave her. And Diane was able to see energy fields around people. And she was also able to make medical diagnoses based on what she saw in people's energy fields. And one of the things that Diane was able to do was that she was able to look at a bar magnet from several feet away, and she could tell you which was the North Pole and which was the South Pole. And how she could do that was that the North Pole was always blue and the South Pole was always red, which I thought was really interesting, because if you look at the if you look at the way that the chakras are described and the colors given to them, what you see is you've got red down at the bottom and blue up at the top, and so it suggests to me, could this whole system be sort of like a bar magnet, in which case bar magnets have a toroidal field around them. And so, to me, this is some of the evidence, that's indirect, that there's really could be something about the idea that we have a consciousness field that's in the shape of a torus. And you've seen that kind of imagery before, I'm sure, heart math type work. And if you look at the brain, what I'd like to suggest is look at the brain differently here. Look at it as this is a section of the brain if you were to slice it this way. And think about, it has this shape that to me suggests that it could be reading the torus. If you can imagine that, if you can imagine having the torus kind of the center of the torus going through the center of the brain, okay? And the other thing I want to point out here is that there's gray matter and white matter in the brain. And the difference between the two is that, there's several differences, but so the gray matter is basically the neurons. And that's what most people tend to focus on. And it's gray because it has the pigment melanin in it, neuromelanin. And the white matter are the glial cells. And the glial cells make up 90% of the brain. And you don't hear much about them. Neuroscience is very dominated by studying neurons, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that when neuroscience began at the beginning of the last century, that it began because of the Golgi stains and other things that enabled them to visualize neurons for the first time. And so the neurons were what took up the stain. And the rest of it was just all one big blob. Well, it turns out that the glial cells, they're 90% of the cells in the brain. And the way that scientists are currently thinking about them is that they are the main integrators of information. So to tell you a little bit about glial cells is that the ones that are the most interesting are there's several types of glial cells. But the ones that are the most interesting are the astrocytes. And the astrocytes are named astrocytes because they're star-shaped. And each one of them connects with around 100 other astrocytes, but they connect by gap junctions. And gap junctions are basically, it's an electrical connection between the cells. And so it enables them to function as though they're one single multinucleated cell. And so we have, it's called a syncytium, and we have those kinds of tissue. The heart is a syncytium, so is skeletal muscle. So when you need a coordinated response, then this is the kind of connection you have between cells. And astrocytes make up 20 to 40% of the cells in our brain. And the percentage of astrocytes seems to correlate with intelligence. And in fact, it was an increase in glial cells that was the main distinguishing feature between Einstein's brain and other brains. And in fact, he had an increase in them right where in the left angular gyrus, an area that we associate with mathematics and the kinds of things that we associate with Einstein. There was a patient that Jason Brandt at Johns Hopkins, and Jason Brandt's a psychologist who does a lot of testing and whatnot, and he had this patient who had the phenomenal memory that was a lot like some of these people I've talked to you about, where this was somebody who just doesn't forget anything, remembers everything, could tell you what they ate for, or what the weather was like or whatever for any day that they'd ever been alive. And he had an extra ring of white glial cells around his hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that we associate with episodic memory. So the glial cells are really fascinating. They communicate within themselves, among themselves by calcium waves. And researchers at Yale believe that they actually are capable of quantum computation. So you have these, and the glial cells can exist in a petri dish without neurons. They don't need neurons, but neurons can't exist in a petri dish without a glial cell. And in fact, we've gone from thinking of the synapse as being two neurons connecting with one another, and now we realize that the glial cells also have a process there. So it's a tripartite synapse now, and what we realize is that the glial cells are actually what are orchestrating and manipulating the neurons. So it's a very analogous situation to what we had with genetics. And I did a fellowship in genetics, and I was part of the Human Genome Project. And back then, we were expecting a lot of genes. We were expecting at least 100,000 genes. And when we discovered we only have about 19,000 genes, we're like, what? And then it turned out that the 90% of the chromosomes that we were just ignoring and thinking it's just the scaffolding to hold the genes, that's actually where all the control mechanisms for gene expression lie. So similarly, the glial cells are probably where a lot of the processing is going, processing is occurring. Now, melanin is very interesting, neuromelanin. And so I have this slide here because you have these nuclei here. This is the substantia nigra. And so these are nuclei in the brainstem that are full of neuromelanin. And the substantia nigra is... that means the black substance because it's so full of this, melanin, this black pigment, and neuromelanin's related to the melanin in our skin, but it's different. Albinos still have neuromelanin. And the substantia nigra, what it does is it's involved in initiating and terminating movements. So when it dies back, loses its pigment, that's when you develop Parkinson's and people have difficulty stopping or starting movements. Then you also have the locus coeruleus here, another pigmented nucleus. And what that does is that's our fight or flight response. And then you also have the Raphe nuclei. And those are involved in the stages of sleep. So, I would like to suggest, it's as though this is the remote control for the brain. And that you've got, these are like little buttons for different functions that, and because they're full of neuromelanin, and we know that neuromelanin has these special properties, I think that, and this is part of why I'm excited to be here talking with you, is because I don't have the answers to all of this, but I'm just sort of trying to outline for you the things, so that you understand what the brain is. Because when most people think of the brain, they just think of neurotransmitters and neurons, and they don't really realize how many different components of the brain there are, and that we really need to be looking at it more like we would look at one of our devices, like an electronic device. Because I think that the brain is basically an instrument used by consciousness. Microtubules are absolutely fascinating. Stuart Hameroff has been, working with Roger Penrose on them, and He believes that they're the site where quantum computation occurs in the brain. Research out of Japan has shown that they're superconductors. And what I mean by that is that they're made up of 40,000 of these tubulin proteins, yet they have the whole structure has less resistance than each of the little proteins that makes it up. There's also a layer of water that it lines the center of this cylinder. And I would like to suggest that it's perfect for reflecting light, and that actually the microtubules are, that light passes through them. And part of the evidence for that comes from Gurwich's work. How many of you are familiar with Gurwich? So Gurwich was someone who back in the 20s discovered something he called mitogenic rays. And they were sort of these bluish purple rays of light that he saw in cells during cellular division. And this is showing you cellular division. And what happens during cellular division is that you have all of the chromosomes paired up with one another, and then they are pulled apart into the separate cells. And what is driving that is a spindle apparatus, which is made up of microtubules. And what's interesting is that when I saw this picture of Gurwich's mitogenic rays, which were not, when people saw them, I mean, it was just really hard for people to believe in it, and it was debunked. But that was before we discovered that we really do, that the body does make biophotons. In fact, we leak biophotons. And so when I looked at this image of the mitogenic rays, I was like, that's the spindle apparatus. He's seeing this in dividing cells. That's the same shape as the spindle apparatus. These microtubules transmit light. And microtubules are also what makes up the cilia. They make up they make up the flagella of a sperm. They make up the cilia. They also, microtubules make up all of our sensory receptors. It turns out for everything, olfaction, vision, sound, all of them involve cilia that are modified. So it keeps coming back to microtubules. And there is melanin that's always dissociated with them. It's like the melanin and the microtubules work together. And in fact, you can have, people can be blind or deaf if they don't have sufficient melanin in their eyes or their ears. So there's this way in which the two are working together. This is just showing you some of the. Now I have this slide up here because the rods in the back of our eyes, we associate those with black and white vision, peripheral vision, but the rods also contain not just rhodopsin, but they also contain cryptochrome, and cryptochrome is a receptor for magnetism. So we have receptors for magnetism in our eyes, which when I saw that, I was, well, isn't that interesting? Because we've had people like Diane who could see magnetic fields. So you start to realize that there really could be something to these phenomena because we're starting to discover the microstructures that could be playing a role. This is an image of the chakras, and so I was interested in this because these are the three chakras. When people think of psychic abilities, they think of the third eye, they think of the crown chakra, and they think of the Alta major chakra. And I was trying to understand. I mean, it was easy for me to, to think about, well, what might be going on here. But, I was thinking, well, what's going on here? And because we're not just talking about the pineal gland here. And this shows you, the pineal gland, it started out as a third eye, literally. There are lizards that still that have a third eye on top of their head. And during evolution, the idea is that mammals have, that the pineal went deeper and deeper into the brain as the limbic system and the cortex and all of that grew up around it. And you can see the pineal right here. Well, what I find interesting is, so this gets back to when I was talking about this sandwich where you have this magnetite membrane. Each one of these membranes contains magnetite, and they also contain, in the ventricles, they also contain cilia, and the cilia are sticking out of glial cells. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is we have to think of how is it that someone with very little brain tissue can still have their brain function at all. And what I suggest is that it's a secondary system, that we have one system that is the microtubules that are in the neurons, but we also have this system that I think is involved in psychic abilities. And so you say, look at how much fluid is there. And then look, this is where the major Alta chakra is as well. Look at how much, this is a significant amount of magnetite and electrolyte fluid. Similarly, you can see this comes all the way around here. This shows you the cilia, and their movements, which is it's a very sophisticated the cilia movements. And then this I thought is interesting because when you look at the sagittal section of the brain, it does look a lot this symbol from Egypt. And the Egyptians knew a lot about the brain. And so I thought that's very interesting. I thought that's very cleverly done because it really does. This is the third ventricle, and then you have this going out here to where, as I said, you've got all that fluid, And once again, you can see here, this is just showing it from another perspective, where you're looking at, you've got this pocket of fluid here, and then these are the ventricles here. And so I'm very interested in people's ideas about how this could be functioning. As I said, remember, there's all this magnetite here, electrolyte fluid, etc. And babies are, when they're born, they have open. I don't know how well you can see that, but they have fontanelles, and which are their soft spots. So they have these little holes in their skull. And if you think about it, babies they're in this, I believe, they're in this telepathic relationship with their mothers. In fact, I think that might actually be how they acquire language. I mean, how is it that they figure out what these sounds that are coming out of our mouth mean relative to the world around us or what somebody's thinking? How do they even make that connection? And the reason why I propose this is because the children who were the most profoundly telepathic were the ones who didn't develop language normally. And so what I suggest is that they kept using the older system. They just continued to be telepathic and didn't have language. I think with children, when they start to acquire language, that takes over. We start to get all excited about their fact that they're speaking and et cetera, and that the telepathy just drops away. So, so I think that's not a coincidence, or it may not be a coincidence that they have these soft spots too. This shows you that they have they have an anterior fontanelle and they have a posterior fontanelle. But this is a very leaky barrier. If you were to think of the skull with all of the magnetite that's in it, lining it, and if you just think of the skull itself, that it's breaking up that barrier. And then this is interesting because when we find these skulls, this is the Edinburgh skull. When we find these skulls and we see these holes in them, people usually assume, they say, "Oh, well, they were doing surgery on them because there was too much pressure in the brain, and so they were putting a hole in there to relieve the pressure." Okay, well, this is not a brain. This is not a skull that is of an immature person. You can see that all of these sutures are well, it's well sutured, basically. So one of the questions that I had is, what if somebody discovered that by putting a hole in your head, you become psychic? And maybe that's the real reason why that hole is there. And this is a picture of Alex Gray's that I think really kind of illustrates, as you can see, as I was saying, if you think of the torus as being, the sort of the center of the torus going down through that central part of the brain, and all of this information being in it, and that we've got two systems going on where we're reading the information from the interior and the exterior. And sometimes, and the two systems are one's supposed to be on, the other one's supposed to be off, but sometimes they're both on at the same time, is my hypothesis. And then I'll just conclude with the symbol which my understanding is that if you think about this, that this is kind of like think of this as being like the brain, that this side is supposed to represent the unconscious. This is supposed to represent the conscious brain. So this would be like the right hemisphere, left hemisphere. And then this is what keeps us in Maya. This is what keeps us, from seeing, And so it's interesting. It's like it's like a little cap on a hole into the brain, and restricting information flow. Anyway, that's a hypothesis. Thank you. Yes.
What about
Yes.
Alzheimer's people? I know that they, all of a sudden, they maybe can't speak and say, "I want dinner," but they can remember every word to every song, church song that they heard, like all 8 verses, or whatever. And also, they seem to, I don't know if they had the ability to paint before, but now they can paint wonderful pictures. What if we sat them in front of a piano? Maybe they could play Mozart and Beethoven and stuff that they never were exposed to. Or, have we ever tried that? Because you hear a lot about Alzheimer's people. "Oh yeah, it's the frontal lobe that they got the problem with." Maybe they're all savants.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because one of the things I've spent a lot of time talking, my area of expertise, when I first went into academia, I was interested in autism, and this was 30 years ago, and autism was so rare, I was told that you won't be able to do that because there's not enough autism. It was 1 in 10,000 people back then, and now, it's 1 in 50. And So I've gotten back into autism, but I spent a lot of time doing research on Alzheimer's. That's what some of my original publications were in. And when you sit and you talk with some of these people, what's interesting is how, what is their disorientation? When you're talking, you're like, oh, it's like, well, where are you today, Mrs. Jones? Oh, I'm in Paris. Oh, really? What's it like there? It's just like, well, how do we know they're not getting non-local information? We don't. And the other thing is that as I said, there's these different types of dementia. And so a lot of people just get called Alzheimer's and they have frontotemporal dementia. And then you're going to also have a difference between people who have, so there's an asymmetry to how dementia develops. And so you might have somebody who predominantly has the left hemisphere affected, and that person I would predict would have more psychic abilities based on the theory than, if somebody might just have their right hemisphere afflicted, and so then they're not as likely. So we would really have to start doing those kind of correlations. But I agree with you, and I think that a lot of people might be experiencing non-local phenomena. We just don't label it as such. So it could be that people who have amazing memories, maybe they're actually visiting the past. Because it's so vivid. Maybe people who have these vivid flashbacks in which it's like they get temporarily disoriented and they really think they're back in Vietnam, maybe they non-locally traveled back. And so I just think that, that I'm just, think it's important to just try to be open-minded about how we think about these things. Yes, Russell?
The non-local perception of information is very interesting. Because the early part of the previous century, Huxley and William James felt that the mind was an impediment to psychic ability. They felt that the brain injury and brain diseases interfered with the brain stopping your psychic. The brain had natural affinity for psychic functioning, seeing into space and seeing into time, and your mind has that ability, and the brain interferes with it. So when you got a hole in the head, or schizophrenia, or some other kind of ailment that interferes with the brain's barrier, then the mind then has direct access to the mind at large. Huxley and James talked about the mind at large, which is what we naturally have ability for, and the nasty brain interferes with that, and once you get an impediment in the brain, then you're open to all the other clairvoyant things. Because, for example, with your first group of people, they were seeming to do telepathy, but I don't know if you did any experiments where the mother didn't know the answer, but there was just a card with the words. There's a lot of evidence, as you know, that people can do telepathy, that people can do direct clairvoyance where nobody knows the answer.
Right.
Your mind can see anything independent of space, independent of time, and you don't require a so-called sender. The person is, we have direct perceptual ability, as all of us do. We can learn to do that without a hole in the head and without somebody telepathically sending you the answer. There's timeless awareness in our nature.
Yeah. Okay. I have another question.
Well, further to Russell's comment, how does this all relate to traditional and shamanic cultures? And the different, perhaps, left to right brain ratio that's functioning.
Yeah, well, so what's happened is in modern society, we've become more and more left-brained. Our educational system teaches us that. And so what's interesting, though, is that fewer and fewer people are reading and more people wanting to watch videos. So it could be that we're shifting back to a more right hemisphere dominant type of culture. The brain, another comment I want to make is that the brain, one of the major transmitters in the brain is GABA, and that's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So the brain's function is predominantly to stop things from happening. Like Russell was saying about the brain gets in the way. And I think what it's doing is, if we didn't have the brain separating things out into all of these different components, we would just experience everything all at once. It's kind of like just, white, and so, and instead of having it broken up into the whole rainbow of colors, what the nervous system is doing is it's just separating everything out so that there can even be some kind of experience. So I don't know how to, I'll go right here, yes?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you have any familiarity with neural networks and artificial intelligence, and whether anyone has incorporated the glial cell component into their neural network models. It seems like if they're not, then they're leaving a lot out.
I agree. I think they are leaving a lot out. And I have a brother who's a physicist, and he's also an artificial intelligence expert. And I think that it really would be good to include the glial cells in that. Absolutely.
You have to do like quantum computing to incorporate that. That might make it a little difficult.
Yeah.
You earlier in your presentation mentioned Leslie Lemke.
Yes.
As a blind Savant pianist who is able to virtually play with great facility. How was that validated? Who made that determination? Is there video, audio?
Oh, absolutely. Look him up. You can even see him in concert on YouTube. Yeah, absolutely. He performed. Well, his mother at that point, she had a piano, and she was doing something similar with him to what she was doing to get him to walk. So she was putting her hands on the keys with him. Okay, but it was like having somebody who's going dunk, dunk, dunk with her assisting. He was using the muscles a little bit, but then to go from that to, she thought that there was somebody had left the radio on, when he sat down and played that piece. I mean, it was just so flawless. And he could hear something and then just hear it once and play it. So he also had this phenomenal memory. Yeah.
Ramses remembered past lives?
That's an interesting question, whether Ramses remembers past lives. You can't, one of the things about Ramses is, he truly is autistic, and you can't have a conversation with him. He wants to tell you what he wants to tell you. But what happened is that when I was in India and I evaluated some savants over there, I basically also helped to introduce them to some other savants. And so they started being telepathic with one another. And some of them claimed to remember past lives with each other. Yeah. Yes?
I loved your presentation and your openness to keep questioning, well, what about this, what about that? You brought up Shafika Karagula. Could I add a couple of things on her?
Sure.
Because I never think women get enough credit, all right? Now, this is one of the most brilliant women in the world. She has a resume similar to Einstein's practically for her field. And she was doing most of her research in the late 50s. The woman she recalls, Diane, if I remember correctly, it's Violet Pettit Neal. She was quite brilliant herself, a psychologist. And she told Karagula, Shafika, you're brilliant academically, but you've got to get more conscious. And she said, what do you mean? She said, you need to look at this body of work. And it was Edgar Cayce.
Mm-hmm. Right.
She went to Virginia Beach, she looked at Cayce's stuff, and she was blown away that somebody who did self-induced hypnotic readings for the first 5 years, Cayce only did it on medical readings. He did not get into past life stuff until after 5 years. When she saw that, she went back to her colleagues who she felt were brilliant doctors who did diagnoses. Every one of them was doing it through higher perception. And they had abilities. She tested them to do things like put down a magazine cover. They were blindfolded, and they put their hand on it, and they would be able to say, I see a woman in a red dress holding the baby. And she got more and more specific with how she tested. Her book, the first one with Viola co-writing it, but she didn't want to be included. It's called Breakthrough to Creativity.
Right,
It can be purchased off the internet for less than $20, and it's phenomenal. You can go on the internet. She did one public radio broadcast, and you can just do Shafiqa Paragula radio broadcast. You can hear her talk for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So I highly recommend people to check her out.
Yeah. No, I was very impressed with her work. Yeah, and I didn't answer your question, Dan, about shamanism and whatnot. So, yeah, I'm actually studying shamanism, and the work that I'm doing with the Native American medicine man. He's definitely amazing. We did a rain-making ceremony on the winter solstice, and it's being credited for having ended the drought. We did it the old-fashioned way, so we've been working with, he has access to archives from interviews with elders of the Chumash tribe from over 100 years ago. This anthropologist had interviewed them. And the anthropologist didn't want the information to get out there very easily. So when he wrote it all up, he took the keys on his typewriter and moved them all around. So it took a while to figure out what the notes say. But it's fascinating. I mean, so we're doing things exactly as they did things 100 years ago. And then the other shamanic tradition that I'm studying is Tibetan Buddhism. And interestingly enough, right after that big eclipse that went across the country on August 21st, I went to Tucson, Arizona. I was invited by Gary Schwartz for a meeting of scientists with the founding of a new science academy, the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. And so I was invited to be one of the speakers and to write a paper for a book that we did. And it was filmed. Each of us was interviewed, and it was filmed for a documentary. And so that's where I met this Native American, and because he's a paleontologist and paleoanthropologist, he's made some amazing discoveries. He has over 100,000 artifacts that he has discovered and identified. And he said to me, he's convinced I'm a reincarnated Native American medicine woman, so he's made me his kopaha. And then the next day I met Michelle Pascal, who lived in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Nepal for 10 years. And while he's filming me, he says, I have to stop filming you right now and just tell you that you are a reincarnated Tibetan Buddhist monk. And I'm like, what is this? So I went to Nepal, and I've been studying with him and this Native American. And a funny story about this, after I came back from Nepal, I sent out a newsletter, and one of my cousins, who I didn't know growing up, he's my cousin twice removed, so he's my grandmother's brother's grandson. He had some experiences about 20 years ago and became interested in consciousness and Buddhism. And he discovered my work and then recognized my name and goes, oh, she's my cousin. So anyway, so he gets my newsletter, and you can go to my website, drhennacy.com, and you can sign up for my newsletter. But anyway, he got my newsletter, and he saw about my trip to Nepal and that I was at the Dalai Lama's monastery there. And he said, can you help me contact the Dalai Lama? I have something for him. And I said, you do? I said, well, what is it you have? And so it turns out on the same week that I had this dream that I was blessed by the Dalai Lama, my cousin in Ohio goes to an auction. He's a gemologist and he collects gems. He goes to an auction and he purchases this vase. And this vase is a commemorative vase from the World Fair in Stockholm in 1897. Okay, and it was celebrating the 25th anniversary of the crowning of the King of Sweden. Okay, and that's not that remarkable, but when he got it home, he opened it up and it had a note inside saying that it used to belong to the Dalai Lama. So then he did some research on this, and what he discovered was that the vase was brought to not this Dalai Lama, but the Dalai Lama before him by this man whose name was Carl Gustav Mannerheim, who was Finnish, and in the early 1900s, he went to China as a spy, and he trekked around China and he went to Tibet and he gave this vase to the Dalai Lama. Then he goes back, and 14 years later, the civil war in Finland breaks out because of the Russian Empire, with the turning over of the Tsar and everything. So the Finnish Civil War breaks out. He becomes the leader of the whites in the Finnish Civil War, and they win. He's considered the greatest Finn, and he became the president of Finland. And so my cousin says, so he says, can you get this vase to the Dalai Lama? I said, oh, yeah. So that's, there's all kinds of things, in the works. Yeah. So I was going to be doing a workshop tomorrow, but I've been just so busy. And what I was thinking is that instead of doing that tomorrow, because I think that you would probably enjoy doing a workshop in which I was able to bring a savant here, instead of just me. And so we're going to postpone and design a new workshop, and Mary will let you know, and it will be in communication. She'll let you know when that'll be. So, okay. Yes, Jerry.
Yeah, I was just thinking, there's something called in biogeometry a brain stand. And the brain stand coordinates the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And it's a torus-like structure, basically. It's not quite shaped that way. And I was just wondering, just a thought that it might be useful at some point to try telepathy experiments when you coordinate the brain with versus non-coordinated brain, right and left. Just a thought, wild thought.
Okay. Thank you. Any other? Yes.
Just two questions to ask. I work a lot with children with autism, and one of the things I'm interested in when you're talking about the hydrocephalus is one thing that calms them and they seek out a lot is there's pressure on the skull, so pressure on the sides here and here especially as well. And I find a lot of the kids I work with seek that out and they respond well to that. And I'm just wondering if there's what that might be for them.
What you mean? What effect is the pressure having?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's Temple Grandin actually developed this machine that would hug her, and so they have difficulty with experiencing light touch. They really crave that deep pressure. It's comforting for them, and it is, and Yeah, and given this, this boy who said, the reason I jump is to keep my, soul inside my body. It makes you wonder, if how much of it is that they're just they're struggling to keep it together. They really are. Yeah. Who? Oh, Susie Miller. Yes, and she does work with autism and telepathy as well. Yes.
I was just wondering about is the heart, assuming, and I don't know, and neurology has a pretty complex neural network which can hold memory in certain ways. I'm just wondering why would we look at the heart at all in terms of and I think what made me think of it is when you showed the picture of the hydrocephalus where there was a lot of the brain matter missing. And is there a chance that the heart picks up a lot of the memory or holds the memory? Or because in children, also some children with autism, one that the non-verbal child I asked the other day if he sees energy around people, and he said no. And I asked him, could he see people's feelings? And he said yes. And so I'm wondering where the heart plays, we look at the brain a lot, but...
Right, yeah, I think that's a good question. What I think is that, I believe in the idea of a holographic sort of representation. And so I really think that memory is encoded throughout. And I think some of the evidence for that and what you're saying about the heart is that research done on people who had heart transplants, and they had this heart transplant, and then they got some of the cravings and characteristics of the persons whose heart they have, and so it makes you wonder, that's how's that possible? And I think it's because of the fact, if you think the heart's such a powerful generator, and then if it's contains, some of the memory holographically, maybe.
I wonder if some children with autism operate more from their heart than...
Oh, yes. Oh, I agree with you there. I mean, a lot of them in their writings, they finally had learned how to communicate, because for years, they didn't have any means of communicating. And once we came up with these tablets and computers and whatnot, it finally just opened up this whole world. And if you read what they write, they're like, why don't we all love one another? And, they write about God and angels. They're really highly spiritual and loving. And yet people respond to the fact that they're awkward in their bodies, or they don't have good eye contact. People respond to that and treat them as though they don't have feelings, but they have lots of feelings, and they're just beautiful beings.
There's thought that the frequency of children with autism is higher than the frequency of people without autism characterized. Do you think is that something you've ever? I don't know how one would measure that, whether it's the magnetic frequency, but they just vibrating at a high level, and that's why it is so hard to ground themselves on this earth.
Well, I think with Ramses, what's interesting is Ramses is he's so bright. He's just so extraordinarily bright. And his mother told me that she didn't believe in auras until one day she went into his bedroom, and she said she just saw this light just shooting out of him, And I do think that they are probably operating at a higher vibration, higher energy. Yeah.
Is that easily, or is it scientifically? I don't know. Something that picks up the frequency.
I think it'd be really interesting we could ask other people here, how would you measure that? But I think what I'd want to be measuring is their aura, and so, whatever you believe is a way that one can actually measure that.
Yeah, The
Yes.
thing about frequencies and so on, you can take it literally, you can take it metaphorically, but if you're going to measure the frequency of anything, you first have to know what it is, what energy you're detecting and measuring. And a lot of that, we're all, perhaps on the threshold of being able to identify a whole spectrum of energies that we haven't acknowledged before. But I don't think we're quite there yet. I mean, we can obviously measure brain waves, which are electrical. But this is a very interesting potential area, but I don't think we're there yet in terms of things like frequency per se.
Yeah.
I hope that's clear enough. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of these children have seizures too, which tells you that they've got, brainstorms going on.
Yes. Changing a little bit the subject, and since you are not going to teach tomorrow the seminar, could you talk to us a little bit about that special meditation that you were going to teach tomorrow, about the meditation of the rose or the way of the rose, and why it's so important to you?
Well, it's a meditation that I have a colleague in Oregon who studied with someone named Joe Kapersky. Has anyone ever heard of him? He was in LA. He was a psychic. Anyways, she studied with him. And she had such profound experiences with the meditation that she said, Diane, you really need to learn this, and learn more about it. So, and what's interesting is that it's a meditation in which you visualize light, moving through your body, and so and because of the importance that I think that I thought I thought it would fit with this presentation because of the importance of light. I mean, I think that light is playing a major role in how the brain works, and in fact, I mean, I've thought about could these microtubules that I think are transmitting light, and I've explained why. I mean, could they basically be like little biological lasers? Could it be that that's how we can get a holographic, representation is through somehow some mechanism that way? In the back.
It's somewhat out of your field, but talking about schizophrenia and other types of mental disorders, are there any studies that talk about, is it really maybe a chemical problem or possibly a psychic problem? Do you have any?
Well, one of the, he was asking about schizophrenia. I mean, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about schizophrenia that fits in with what I'm talking about is that there's something about being blind that makes you immune to schizophrenia. And I think it's because you've got these two systems. You've got the system that's the sensory system that, our eyes, our sensory system, we're mesmerized by what we see and hear and taste and touch and all of that. But, and our brain helps to sort of simulate a reality for us. And we know, a good example of, how our brain does that is the visual blind spot, because we don't see a hole in our visual field. Our brain's able to fill that in. And so that's one system. But then when we're dreaming in dreaming sleep, okay, that system's all shut down. And then you've got this other fabricated reality, that's our dream reality. And so what I think happens with people with schizophrenia is that they're somehow got both systems on, and we're only meant to have one or the other on at any time. So, something else I wanted to say about, anyway, that's enough. Okay. Yes. Sir.
Couple of quick questions. Do you feel that we are where our thoughts are? And is there an experiment done to see if something else can be really triggered with your thoughts remotely anywhere in the universe?
I'm sorry, I want to make sure.
Is there a way to kind of prove because sometimes you have physical body here, we are, but can we also be where our thoughts are? Because thoughts are also the fastest thing, faster than light, right? The thought. So can we scientifically prove, which I think they have some experiments that I feel that can be done, where you can prove instruments will be acting where you put your thoughts into somewhere far away. I don't know if you've done any experiments along that line.
Well, I haven't done any experiments like that, but are you familiar with Dean Radin's work on meditation, meditators who doing basically the double slit experiment? So in the double slit experiment, what you have is you get a wave-like pattern, okay, if you're not measuring or watching it, but if you're watching it, you get these slits, okay, that these patches for the two slits, you know, because it's like the photon has to go through one or the other. And he did an experiment in which he had meditators, experienced meditators, in another room meditate on the apparatus, and it was as though you were measuring it. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, did the results come out? Did the instrument start to behave like as if there was somebody there or no?
I'm sorry.
Did the instrument, like EEG for example?
Yeah, it behaved as though somebody was watching it. Yeah.
So you are that means there where your thoughts are.
I'm trying to
So
understand.
you are where your thoughts are.
Oh, you are where your thoughts are.
In a way.
Yeah.
The other
Yeah.
part is your third eye part. When you talk about focus and meditation, it's like Mahatma Buddha also, or Jesus Christ. When you're putting the thought, where exactly are you putting it? And you think there may be part of the magnetic stuff that you have, that you talked about, that's connecting to the universe somehow, related, correlated, that your thoughts are putting intensified inside the system somehow to open up something that's supposed to lead up to the next stage. Like, you know, what Dalai Lama might be teaching you or others.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yes, sir.
Do you know if there's ever been an extensive study of the DNA of savants?
No, there hasn't been. No. And I'm not. There's genius is inherited, but I've never seen any reports of savantism being inherited. So, okay, and there's maybe a couple more questions.
In my teenage years, I was introduced to the Silva method from Jose Silva, and you know he discovered he was teaching his daughters to be better students by hypnosis. And when they started answering his questions before he asked them, he realized with an epiphany that they were being, psychic when they were under this hypnosis. Much like the gentleman mentioned, Edgar Casey. Edgar Casey learned about his own psychic abilities through a traveling hypnotist who came to town, and he discovered the beginning of his lifetime of psychic prognostication and other things. So Jose Silva, what it's worth, had a hypothesis that the brain would be more, or the mind would be more intuitive if you were operating at alpha waves, which is associated with dream sleep. It's a slower frequency of EEG waves. And when people would do this, they would be able to be taught to be psychic. I myself experimented with lots of things, and one day I was doing a trick testing my ability to guess cards. So I was going to a meditative level, and I was guessing the suit of cards, and I would always be kind of close to 17-ish or something. 13 would be, the suit would be a random probability. You know, anything close with 13 would be anything. But as I was doing this, and the TV was on in the background, there was a loud noise. And it shocked my mind. I felt an energy rush, and I got 13 in a row, correct. It was a fascinating experience for me. But there's a lot to this topic of EEG waves and and an ability to be more intuitive at a level. I think that's why meditation is one of the keys to it.
Yes.
You've mentioned it's a lot, it's tangential, but...
Yes, and this Roseway meditation, it's a lot like a hypnotic induction. And so, the Ericksonian type of hypnotic induction is very different. Most people think of, watch this, clock go back and forth. This is hypnotic induction, but you can use your words and your voice, and you can get people to relax. And I think what's happening is that you're quieting those areas of the brain that are inhibitory. You're quieting, just like the areas of the brain when you're going into sleep. You're quieting it. So, okay. Let me just take one question.
Hoping there's somebody to talk to in person after, but I don't know if that's possible, so I'll just throw out really quick. This topic is really fascinating to me, and it's really important what you're doing. And I've worked with kids with autism my whole life, just as an aide, a friend, a babysitter, and now I'm going to be training to be a teacher, although this is the path that really fascinates me, and it's needed. Because I know so many people with autism that are just locked away inside these bodies and unable to communicate. And now that I've seen firsthand, I've had my own first experience with assisted typing where I helped an adult, and it was really confusing because it was a lot of shared thought going on. I didn't know whose thoughts were whose. It was fascinating but very scary. It didn't feel supported for me due to the family's belief systems. Anyway, that connected me into a very wonderful online group of mothers, autists themselves, who are all experiencing telepathy and either type independently or assisted. And they have a lot to say, and I really want to connect you.
Yes, please do. Go to my website or grab one of my business cards, and please do contact me. But I've heard from a lot of these therapists who work with these autistic children that are telepathic that they find themselves knowing what the kid is thinking. So they say, "How can I be telepathic?" So it's very interesting. So, okay, I guess one last question back here.
Yeah, so just to bring it up a little bit again with breakthrough through creativity, because you brought up auras and chakras. In those days, the two of them did not use that language. They called it the energy field around the human body, and the vortexes from the top of the head down to the feet. And when they interviewed their colleagues, these were brilliant doctors, university level, who were doing great diagnoses, they all said that's what they were looking at. That as soon as the person walked in who was ill, they could diagnose it instantly. But of course, they took them through the protocols of blood tests and x-rays and so forth, because they were under the umbrella of the AMA. They did not want to get in trouble.
That's right. They didn't want to lose their license like I did temporarily.
So it's quite fascinating that they were all saying instantly they could see it.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure.